India is celebrated globally as a booming $4 trillion economic superpower. Yet, simultaneously, roughly 800 million Indian citizens rely on government food rations simply to survive. We typically measure national success using gross domestic product, or GDP. But as a dashboard for human prosperity, GDP has a major blind spot. This chart splits the workforce into two realities. The formal corporate sector, driving headline GDP, employs just 6%. The remaining 94%, micro-enterprises, farmers, and wage workers, operate outside the formal tax structure. Therefore, their daily economic reality is effectively invisible in official GDP calculations. So when political leaders point to rapid economic growth, they are taking the financial success of a tiny elite and projecting it onto a vast majority that is, in reality, stagnating. The metrics are optimizing for the wrong India. To see how wealth is actively extracted from the bottom and pushed to the top, we have to look at the mechanics of national policy. The goods and services tax acts as a perfect example, a system that looks highly efficient on a spreadsheet, but actively punishes the unorganized sector. Let's ground this in reality. Imagine a large, registered corporate cafe chain. Now compare them to this street vendor, sitting at a small counter preparing tea. This flowchart maps out the cost of a cup of tea. When the street vendor buys raw materials like milk and tea leaves, he pays GST. But because he is unregistered, that tax is a dead end. He bears the absolute full mathematical burden of that cost, eating directly into his meager profits. Now look at the corporate chain on this parallel line. Because they are part of the formal system, they use a mechanism called an input tax credit. The corporation legally recovers the tax paid on their ingredients from the government. This lowers their operational costs and artificially widens their profit margins against the street vendor. This mathematical penalty created severe backlash across unorganized trades. Millions of small businesses lost their competitive edge, forcing consumer demand and capital to flow directly into the formal corporate sector. The tax code here functions as an engineered wealth transfer. It extracts capital from the most vulnerable workers while legally subsidizing corporate margins. Beyond the tax penalties, unorganized workers spent a decade weathering 4 distinct economic shocks: the sudden demonetization of cash, the faulty rollout of the GST, a massive credit crisis among non-banking financial companies, and the COVID-19 lockdowns. During these chaotic periods, a shadow economy thrives. Corrupt executives and politicians game the system, siphoning public funds away from the critical infrastructure that the working class desperately needs to recover. Even if we look slightly higher up the ladder, the picture remains grim. For the middle class, especially those sitting in uniform corporate cubicles in the tech and service sectors, salaries have completely flatlined against inflation for decades. Now, artificial intelligence threatens to automate those remaining middle-class pillars, like entry-level coding and accounting, which will inevitably drive wages down even further. This graph displays what economists call the S-curve. Notice this long, flat tail at the bottom. It represents a poverty trap. In today's highly consolidated market, a massive threshold of upfront capital is required just to start building wealth, effectively locking out anyone trying to climb from the bottom. The modern Indian economy is structurally designed to squeeze the middle class and trap the poor. Exponential financial growth is mathematically reserved for the tiny elite who own the intellectual property sitting at the very top of that S-curve. A deeply entrenched political myth prevents us from fixing this. It's the belief that generating wealth at the top will eventually trickle down, and that giving direct financial aid to the poor will simply make them lazy and addicted to handouts. We can test that assumption using rigorous randomized controlled trial data, the exact research that earned economists like Abhijit Banerjee a Nobel Prize. The data shows the exact opposite of the myth. Giving people in extreme poverty a direct lump sum injection of capital overwhelmingly leads to business creation. In long-term studies, recipients of these single capital injections were still 40% richer 17 years later. This evidence forms the backbone of macroeconomic survival. Right now, formal corporations, the 6%, are operating below their production capacity. They cannot grow because the 94% simply lack the disposable income to buy their products. the cure requires massive bottom-up interventions. We need inclusive minimum support prices for agricultural workers and state-backed cooperatives for micro-enterprises. These policies generate real, sustained consumer demand at the lowest economic levels. To build a functional economy, leadership must stop optimizing for a vanity $4 trillion GDP metric. Prosperity depends on treating the 94% as the nation's fundamental economic engine. When you fix the bottom, the top takes care of itself.